Okay, everyone, welcome to this week's edition of Civics Live. I'm your host, Ken Hunter, and thank you very much for joining us. You can see I'm trying to still get lined up here. This is the fun part of trying to do this right after teaching a class, and I did make one change in that I did decide to change where I did this. I'm using a different room for tonight's video presentation. And tonight we're going to be talking about a very important topic known as judicial selection. This is probably one of the more important subjects that we will cover in the course of this program over the next couple of days. Now, if you'll give me just a second, I am trying to do something real quick. To get myself set up so that I can check and make sure that I'm able to monitor what we're doing here. Obviously, it's kind of important to make sure that what I'm doing is actually working. But then I will probably start over again just to make sure that everything is working properly, and it is, which is great. So we're going to go ahead and give a slightly better start. I'm going to actually move this around a little bit to make sure that it doesn't interfere with the screen. In fact, I'm going to move my camera up to the top, and that should do better. So we're going to look at that real quick. I'm actually going to go back and just reduce it a little bit. You don't need to see that. The joys of live TV, of trying to make the magic happen. I know some of you are like, would you stop with this? Say, well, for right now, I'm just going to go to screen only. That's all you really need to see. And so you won't get to see my face, which is probably not a bad idea, but welcome to Civics Live. Welcome to our lesson for Wednesday, April 17th, where we will be talking about the very important subject of judicial selection. If you follow the news, you've seen that there's a lot going on a regular basis politically with respect to this topic, but I just want to kind of dial it back and just look purely at the issues specifically that we're dealing with when we're talking about judicial selection, because it is a very important topic. It has very important relevance to the overall function of government, and there are some couple of technical things that you need to know as a citizen for how judges are selected to serve on the various courts at the state level as well as at the federal level. So let's go ahead and get started. And first of all, talk about why judicial selection is so important and how it is done at the federal level compared to how it is done at the state level, as well as talking about different methods that are used in state courts. Not every state is the same, and we'll talk about how they're different and the advantages and disadvantages of those. So look forward to having this discussion over the next 20 to 25 minutes. First, let's get into why judicial selection is so important. Well, the judicial branch is our third branch of government in our system, and this is true at the state level, it's true at the federal level, it's true all throughout American government, that the third branch is the judicial branch. The primary document, of course, is our U.S. Constitution, which sets the tone also for our state constitutions, and in Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution, Article 3 specifically being about the judicial branch, it specifically discusses what the role of the court shall be, and that is that judicial power shall extend to all cases in law and equity arising under the Constitution, the laws of the United States, and treaties made of which shall be made under their authority, to all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers and councils. So it does apply to ambassadors and people who are serving in this country, to all cases of admiralty and maritime jurisdiction. So it does apply to the law of the sea, and that also applies to the law of the air now. To controversies to which the United States shall be a party. So again, It's kind of like that if the U.S. is a party, whether it's a private citizen or another government, the federal courts oversee that, to controversies between two or more states. In other words, when one state is suing another, which has happened in the past. I can remember one case growing up, of course, being a resident of Tennessee, where the state of North Carolina sued the state of Tennessee over pollution that occurred in Tennessee and how it was affecting the French Broad River entering into North Carolina. That was done in a federal court. The controversy between two or more states, so that's very important. Between a state and citizens of another state, so typically, like if there's an example where a citizen in another state may owe taxes or may have other issues, they have to take to the federal court. That is not a resident of their state. Between citizens of different states, that is, of course, with a dispute that is not where the injury or circumstance hasn't happened in a specific state. Between citizens of the same state claiming lands under grants of different states, and between a state or the citizens thereof and foreign state citizens or subjects. So you can see that there's a tremendous amount of authority that the federal court has, and that in itself is very important with respect to why they have such an important role when it comes to judicial review and the role that our courts play in our government, and why the selection of the judges that administer these laws is very important. It's also true and important at the state level. Article 4, Section 1 of the North Carolina Constitution, and I apologize, it is misspelled there, so we're going to fix that real quick. But Article 4, Section 1 of the North Carolina Constitution talks a little bit about the powers, and this is very similar to the powers that you would see at the state level, in that the judicial power of the state shall be vested in a court for the trial of impeachments and in a general court of justice. And it's the general court of justice that we're talking about here with respect to North Carolina, that the General Assembly shall have no power to deprive the judicial department of any power or jurisdiction that rightfully pertains to it as a coordinate department of the government. So what that means is that its authority with respect to being the judicial branch cannot be relegated or limited by the state legislature, nor shall it establish or authorize any courts outside those other than is permitted by this article. In other words, the courts have the power to manage themselves. So the state legislature cannot create courts outside of this scope, outside of this range. So it does establish for an independent judiciary at the state level, much like we have an independent judiciary at the federal level. So, of course, this all emphasizes why it's important that we have strong judges. So how do we select them? For federal judges, it's pretty simple, and it's identified in Article 2, Section 2 of the United States Constitution. Very simply put, the president has the sole authority to nominate judges or justices to the federal courts. And the United States Senate has the sole authority to confirm those nominations or allow them to actually take office through the principle known as advise and consent that is identified in Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. That is the authority that is granted. Advise and consent typically means a majority vote. So basically, in order to be a member of a federal court, you first have to be nominated by the president, and then you have to be confirmed by a majority vote of the United States Senate. With that comes a term of good behavior, which in reality means life. There is no set retirement date on the term of service. There has been talk in the past of creating such standards, but those do not exist in our federal court system. There is no set retirement on that term of service. Our federal system is rather expansive. We have, of course, the 9 Supreme Court justices. They're probably the 9 most recognized judges in the United States and among the most recognized judges in all the world. We also have 13 Court of Appeals districts, and those are the courts of appeals that hear cases arising from state Supreme Courts and state courts, as well as from the federal district courts. There are 12 districts, and we'll show you a map here in a second, that serve the United States as well as the territories of the United States, and these are like regional courts, and they're all based in different cities. For example, North Carolina is in the 4th district, which is based in Richmond, Virginia. There is also what is known as the D.C. Circuit, the District of Columbia Circuit Court of Appeals. And that particular Court of Appeals, along with cases that originate in Washington, D.C., they also hear a lot of times cases where the U.S. is a defendant or perhaps disputes between states or other types of cases. There's a large number of cases that are heard by the U.S. Court of Appeals. It is also a court that once a particular district has heard an appeal, it can be taken into the D.C. Court of Appeals before it's taken to the Supreme Court. Then below that, there are 94 federal district courts, and these are where federal trials take place. When people or entities have been indicted or charged with federal crimes, it is in these courts through trial that these cases are heard. Currently, we take all of these courts together, there are 870 federal judgeships. So at any particular time, there are vacancies, and it is an ongoing process in our government between both the president and also the United States Senate for the selection, for the nomination, and then the confirmation or approval of nominations to fill these vacancies that occur. And this is a brief map that shows, again, what those geographies look like. You can see some are larger, some are smaller. You can see there the 9th district is actually a very large district. This probably gets the most notice in the news of late. You see there the 4th district, of which North Carolina, where we are currently, houses. It includes South Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland. So federal district cases in those states would go then to the 4th Circuit Court of Appeals. And there are those types of cases that are heard where if they are of a national issue, they will a lot of times try to shop that particular case. The people who try to bring it to trial to try to get a ruling or try to get it through the process of judicial review to try to attempt to have the Supreme Court rule on it to determine constitutionality or unconstitutionality of a given law at the state or federal level. Those, of course, are perhaps the most recognized cases from a political and media value. Those cases, a lot of times what they'll try to do is take it to a particular district or try to set up a case in a particular district so that they can try to get a particular ruling that forces an appeal that then leads to the Supreme Court. So there's a lot of play that occurs in these, but typically what these districts serve is that these districts serve to be the appellate courts for cases that originate in those federal district courts or that go through the Supreme Courts of the state to the state court Supreme Courts of the states in which those districts are residing. And it's important to keep that in mind as we move forward, because not every appellate district is the same. So when it comes to selecting our federal judges, we have a couple of things we have to take into consideration. And these qualifications are very important. First of all, the legal education and legal experience of judicial candidates is very important. You want to make sure that these are men and women who are, first of all, very good attorneys. They need to have a very strong understanding of the law. So this is not something for just any attorney or just anyone. So people are typically reviewed by the American Bar Association, as well as perhaps various state bar associations and other legal groups, to determine that they've got the proper mental fitness and capacity and knowledge and experience to do the job. Then there's political considerations that often can deal with the political identity of a judge. Typically, a president does not nominate a judge who does not share their political identity. So a Republican typically nominates Republicans and Democrats typically nominate Democrats. That's just the way it is. There is also the fact that, generally speaking, a president has a general legal judicial philosophy that he or she wants to advocate. Either they believe in original intent, which we'll talk about later. I'll spend probably a lesson talking about different views of the Constitution with respect to the role of the courts and the role of constitutionality. Or they believe that the Constitution is can be more broadly defined, and that, of course, expands the authority of the federal government. So whether they're originalists or they're an expansionist in terms of the role of the Constitution and how laws can be constitutional, unconstitutional, and the scope and powers of the federal government, that philosophical role is going to play in the decision that a politician makes, like the president makes, in terms of who they nominate for a judicial position. Then there's obviously a desire that we want the courts to represent the citizenry. So there is, and this is based on what I've read in the literature and what's studied in the literature, an effort made by the president and by the Senate to try to achieve a balance of identity. And that means that demographic characteristics, including race, gender, religious beliefs, do factor into considerations of who is appointed for judgeship positions. And that is done with the best of intentions. It's not done purely, it's done for the right reasons. It's done to create a judicial body that by being representative of the public can also take into consideration those experiences of the broader public as they are involved in the adjudication of federal law. Now, the process itself, there's a couple of key things to think about. First of all, when we talk about district courts, typically presidents and the White House don't have people they have in mind for district court positions. What they typically do when it comes to those federal district courts is they take recommendations of the senators from the states in which those courts reside. I think all federal district courts actually reside within a given state. They don't cross state lines. So, for example, the Court of North Carolina, I think North Carolina has a couple of federal districts. The senators for North Carolina would be responsible for making recommendations about who those federal district court judges are going to be, and usually the president listens to those, even potentially if they are not necessarily of the same party. Typically, they've worked it out where they find someone that they can agree upon. Of course, at the end of the day, the president has total discretion about who they wish to nominate. The nomination is made by the president. It is not made by any other party. And then that nomination is then referred to the Senate Judiciary Committee. This is a committee of members of the Senate, all of whom typically are lawyers, many of whom are very knowledgeable lawyers, some of whom may be former federal judges or at least former state judges and former attorney generals. And they review the nominations, they review them, and then they hold hearings to talk with the judge, to ask questions about their judicial philosophy, about their experience. Any questionable activities or behaviors are discussed. In the past, and in probably 9 out of 10 cases, these are rather matter-of-fact proceedings. We obviously have seen, in the case of Brett Kavanaugh, the most recent confirmed justice of the United States Supreme Court, but also in some Court of Appeals judges, as well as, of course, back in the 90s with Justice Clarence Thomas, how these hearings can, however, devolve into more political sideshow. And that's very unfortunate because they end up dealing with issues they end up becoming more of a political weapon, whether it's being used by the majority or the minority in a given case. And by that, I mean the political majority or the political minority. Once the Senate Judiciary Committee has completed its review process, it is then supposed to vote on a recommendation to pass on, which is done prior to passing on the nomination to the full chamber. It's important to note that while the committee can choose whether to recommend or not recommend, the nomination still goes to the full chamber. So even if they vote not to recommend, that nominee would still go forth. Now, normally if a nominee is not recommended by the Senate Judiciary Committee, chances are that nominee will then withdraw and another nominee will be picked in their place. However, there have been a few cases where that hasn't happened. Perhaps the most notable case of one that did not get confirmed was the most recent one of note was Robert Bork, who had been the Solicitor General under Richard Nixon. He ended up being the acting Attorney General during the infamous Saturday evening massacre when Nixon both fired his then Attorney General and Assistant Attorney General, as well as the Special Prosecutor into the Watergate affair. And Bork was actually the judge. At that time, he served as Solicitor General. And Solicitor General, by the way, is basically the attorney that represents the federal government in cases that appear before the federal court. So they represent the interests of the federal government. So it's kind of like the U.S. government's lawyer, like if they're a defendant or a party in a lawsuit. And that case obviously was a very tough one because obviously his career working in the Nixon administration, Congress did not agree with his appointment and as such voted against it. At that time, the Senate was controlled by Democrats and Bork obviously was Republican, nominated by President Reagan. So in fact, let's take a look at something interesting I found recently from the Pew Research Center, and that's talking about the rise in no votes. As you can see, going back for several presidents, even Reagan, you can see most federal judgeships did not receive a large number of no votes. But you started noticing a tick up during the Clinton administration in the mid to late 90s. It also went up then a little bit under George W. Bush. Again, went up a little bit during the Obama administration, but you can see a substantial increase during these first couple of years of the Trump administration in terms of the number of no votes that are being cast during the confirmation process. So as a result, typically in the past, most judges would receive hardly any no votes, even judges who are considered controversial. Again, that level of judicial experience was often the deciding factor when politicians were making their decisions. And so it would not be factored that much. But in recent years, that has not become the case. And more we have seen where under previous administration, in the present time, where the controversial nature of a candidate, particularly on philosophical issues, perhaps the way that a judge would vote on particular social issues that are of hot button nature in public discussion, has generated a higher number of no votes, and that kind of creates a challenge when you're trying to confirm judges, when you're trying to get judges through the confirmation process, because it ends up taking a lot more time and becomes a lot more challenging process. If you saw our Facebook post from a couple of days ago, I did want to bring up one such case. This is a guy by the name of Daniel Domenico. He served as a former Solicitor General of Colorado, which means this guy who had also clerked for a federal judge, he was the kind of person that typically makes for an excellent candidate for a federal district judge position. He had strong judicial experience, and he had been a Solicitor General at the state level. So under normal circumstances, whether he was appointed by a Democrat or Republican, he would be a strong candidate for a federal district judge position. Well, he was nominated by President Trump in 2017. No action was taken on his nomination in 2017. It was delayed. No action was taken on him in 2018. And finally, in 2019, after over 2 years of waiting, his nomination on the third attempt was actually finally confirmed by the Senate last week. So here in a couple of days, he will finally be sworn in as a federal district judge after being first nominated in 2017. It's a rather interesting situation, and this is not the only case of this. Delays in judicial confirmations have become more prevalent, and again, this is a side effect, an unfortunate side effect of the growing weaponization of politics, of people on different sides not being able to reach agreement, and as such, creating more delay and gridlock in various processes like the confirmation of judges, which we need in order to keep the courts running. So that takes care for this discussion of federal judicial selection. So now let's get into the selection of state judges. And to be honest, when we talk about the selection of state judges, we're really talking about seeing how states as the laboratories of democracy really act, because states use different models. The states don't all use the same method. And the method that we see used at the federal level is actually the exception rather than the norm at the state level. Many of them actually engage the public, not just how they may use elected officials, but they actually engage the public in selection through the direct election of judges. And that's the case in many states. And really, it reflects kind of a mentality on a basis within each state of how they seem to view the legislature in terms of its authority, as well as the citizens. And if they view that the citizens should have more authority, citizens typically get more authority in selecting judges. If they think that things should be more centralized and left up to a legislature, that it's a more Republican form of government as opposed to a democracy, then they are likely to say, then we're going to let it be turned over to the legislature or to the governor. And as this creates kind of differences and pulls the nature of the selection of judges in different ways. Because in some cases, you even have partisan elections where judges actually run under political parties. They run as Republicans and Democrats. In many states, that's not the case. They run as nonpartisan. They don't run under a given party. But obviously, that would create differences in terms of the tone and the manner in which judges conduct their races. If they ran in a nonpartisan fashion, it perhaps would be less politically polarizing than it would be if they were running in a partisan race. And perhaps there's value in that because you can perhaps learn more about the judicial philosophy of the judge. You can kind of learn more about how they view treating certain criminal cases, how they look at punishment standards and sentencing guidelines, particularly when you're looking at trial judges, when you're looking at those who serve at an appellate level or serve in state Supreme Courts. You may look at their view of the state of the power of government overall. However, at the same time, it also means that perhaps we don't pay enough attention to perhaps the legal quality, the experience and educational qualifications of a judge. And so, whereas we're picking judges more on political standards in an elected, when we use elected models, when we are using legislative selection or executive selection, it's typically going to be more oriented. There's going to be more consideration. I shouldn't say more, but more oriented, but more consideration of their actual qualifications. And of course, obviously, there are still political consideration, particularly when governors appoint judges, like how they do here in North Carolina to the Supreme Court, in some for filling retirees. But the fact is, there is enough to be. There are a lot of different factors that have to be considered, and not to say that one method is necessarily better than the other. I want to make that clear. Each state is unique, and I think at the end of the day, it all washes out in a lot of ways. But it is important to understand that it is not the same everywhere, and it's important that as citizens, that if we have the power to elect judges, that we are careful and aware in what we are doing when we are deciding